Professor Iain Benson will now take the rostrum.
Thanks very much. I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation to be here and choosing the important theme of religious pluralism. You'll see that for this paper I've added the word diversity to our reflections. What we mean by pluralism and diversity are important, as there are many definitions, not all of which can fit alongside religions that hold to claims of truth for themselves and the world around them. I'm not going to deal so much with what forms of religious education work in religious schools. What I'm concerned with most importantly in this paper is to develop a conception of civic virtue that transcends different communities and transcends the split between public and private schools and so on. I'm looking for concepts of virtue that are basic to citizenship. And this is needed for reasons I'll explain that have to do with a slide towards a kind of moral emptiness in contemporary educations, particularly the replacement of moral language with this term values. I'm going to argue that in common with several philosophers who've written about this extensively, the term values is largely bankrupt. And when we use it, we think we're conveying moral truth, but in fact, because the primary statement in a values world is you have yours and I have mine, and then we don't really know how we get from there to the shared categories, whether it's family values, American values, Canadian values, Namibian values, it's very ambiguous. At best, values suggests choices of the will, but it doesn't really get us very far. George Grant, the Canadian philosopher, said that values language is an obscuring language for morality used when the idea of purpose has been destroyed. I'll repeat that again because it's so profound. An obscuring language for morality used when the idea of purpose has been destroyed. Human beings don't like to talk as if there's no moral purpose. So they use a language that, in my view, is entirely plastic, this term values, to give themselves the sense that there's a moral discourse going on. But if we push it very far, it breaks down completely. I'll give you an example. If you said, as a politician, what we need in this country is more education about values, everybody would nod. And then if you say, on this issue of, pick an issue, abortion, euthanasia, the role of women, I think X, suddenly the room would have divided into the specifics of the moral question at issue, women, abortion, and so on. Yet they were all nodding about values, but when it became specific moral questions, the room divided. That's our cultural problem in a nutshell. Values does not convey objective meaning the way we think it does. Okay, so what I want to do then, very quickly, is spell out, first of all, the nature of virtues themselves and civic virtues in particular, and then particularly some cautions about the limits of both religion and the state in terms of what type of virtues are properly applied to each. Virtues can be, as I'll say, personal and associational or communal, or civic or public. And it's important to remember that. Virtues are good things, but they have their proper sphere of operation. Finally, I'll argue about the role that virtues play in interfaith dialogue and in culture building. I want to begin with a quotation from Christopher Dawson, historian, who in 1938, in a book called Progress in Religion, his best-known book, said this. This is 1938, coming on for a century ago. We have come to take it for granted that the unifying force in society is material interest, and that spiritual conviction is a source of strife and division. Modern civilization has pushed religion and the spiritual elements in culture out of the mainstream of its development, so that they have lost touch with social life and have become sectarianized and impoverished. But at the same time, this has led to the impoverishment of our whole culture. It has borne fruit in that plebeianization of the European spirit, which Nietzsche regarded as the necessary consequence of the disappearance of the spiritual power. In other words, with spiritual and moral questions related to religion being bracketed out of common discussion, bracketed out of curriculum development and so forth, in key ways, we've ended up speaking this language of the personal choice, not viewed against objective categories of right and wrong. Now, the term right and wrong has been considered almost impolite in contemporary discourse, but as Justice Albie Sachs, that great South African recently retired judge of the Constitutional Court, said in a decision from 2000, Christian Education, one of the key things that religion gives culture is not only its members have a sense of meaning and purpose through religion, but it, as he put it, forms the cornerstone of human rights, and then secondly, it helps citizens understand the meaning of right and wrong. So contemporary cultures can't have it both ways. They can't be so sophisticated in their theories that they've reduced all choices to purely subjective preferences, and at the same time criticize the lack of justice in culture. Justice is, after all, one of the four cardinal virtues. So now let's look at, is everything subject to law, or should it be? Imagine a state that creates a friendship act. This act would govern all matters of friendship between people, and would create a justiciable ground to go and complain before a magistrate that a friend has behaved unfairly to you in friendship. Or imagine a family and marriage behavior act that set out who should walk the dog, take out the garbage, or which programs may or may not be watched on television. In both cases, friendship or marriage and family matters, we understand that there's a problem if the law goes all the way down. Why? Because our laws understand a necessary role for the public and for the private. And this is very important to human freedom. So I want to suggest that this basic understanding of a private realm and a public realm also applies to our thinking about virtues. And this brings me to civic virtues. First of all, what is, well, let me deal with a preliminary question, the problem of contemporary pluralism. Fred Dallmeyer, in a book called Integral Pluralism, written a few years ago, says that one of the problems of traditional singular ideas of the state, which is the state has one set of beliefs on certain matters like equality, and then pushes them all down through law, is that it's top down. It fails to develop from the way people actually live in communities. My paper is going to suggest that we need to have a bottom-up understanding based on realism. I was very moved, as I'm sure several of you were this morning, by the Minister for the Alleviation of Poverty, giving specific cases of poverty in the lives of a single mother, for example. That was moving because it did something very unusual. It started with the reality of a person's life, waking in the pre-dawn, working, having to leave children unkissed, and moving through the day. And then bringing it back to the question of how a society formulates its laws. One of the things about religious associations is that they are, in a sense, real. They're how people have chosen to live together. Legislation is in danger of always being a bit unreal because it's done to people, not so much by them. Elected representatives are not necessarily grounded in the realism, and that's why this morning's presentation was so unusual and interesting. So Dallmeyer says that traditional singularity concepts push down from the top, and integral pluralism, he says, should come from the bottom. And I think that's very important. Okay, so what are virtues? Virtues are those aspects of living which we can perceive by reason, sometimes assisted in deeper levels by understandings gleaned from traditions of revelation. So in other words, virtues can be rational, perceived by how people think, but they're also informed by traditions of revelation. You think of all the religions that are represented in this room, they have their traditions and stories, their narratives, which give them meaning in the culture. Virtues have been divided into those dispositions or attitudes related to conduct that are understood to be in conformity with what is right and wrong. Okay, the language of virtue has two main divisions. First, personal or associational virtues. These may be explained in different terms in different traditions. In my own tradition, that of the Roman Catholic Church, these types of virtues are theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity. You all know those terms. and the natural virtues, which contain, amongst other things, the cardinal virtues of justice, wisdom, moderation, and courage. In my tradition, it's understood that the natural virtues, justice, wisdom, moderation, and courage, are perfected, made richer and deeper by the theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, and that the greatest virtue of all is charity. So charity, in a sense, perfects the natural virtues. I hope I'm not making this too complex. I'm trying to make it simple. It's a lovely structure. It's much richer, I think you'll agree, than simply saying values. Suddenly now we're talking about concepts like justice and wisdom, moderation and courage that span traditions. Each tradition has its own language for these things, whether it's Islam, Judaism, Sikh, Hindu traditions. All of them have the language that cluster around courage, justice. Think of the African conception of Ubuntu, this idea of the self understood in relation to others, not simply existing in an isolated way. Okay, what are civic virtues then? I've just described the personal or virtues, or associational virtues. Now, civic virtues are different. Now, here I draw on the work of the American political philosopher William Galston, a wonderful book he wrote in 1991 called Liberal Purposes. And in that, he spells out 10 what he calls predispositions to civic virtue. And they're as follows: social peace, the rule of law, the recognition of diversity, tendency towards inclusiveness, minimum decency. And he says that minimum decency rules out what he calls the two great affronts, which are wanton brutality and desperate poverty. Next, affluence. It's a good thing. It generates, as far as possible for all, discretionary resources, which people can then choose to use how they wish, and for example, charitable giving. So affluence is a good. Scope for development. This means that there's a multiplicity of institutes devoted to education and training on many different levels of rigor and complexity, and allows as much as possible equality of access, not based on differences of birth, wealth, or background. Again, these are ideals. Okay? Approximate justice, which is a tendency towards justice, not rigid standards or strict standards of distributive justice, inconsistent with freedom. Openness to truth is another one. And this is reflected in the diversity of universities and research institutes, public and private, and the freedom of scholars to investigate things as they believe them to be important. Finally, respect for privacy, which I touched on earlier. Not everything of importance to people occurs in the public sphere, and a sphere of private life, as sentiments, affections, and beliefs must coexist with public imperatives and largely free of them. My point earlier about the Friendship Act or the Family Act, you don't want the state all the way down into those private realms. Okay, so what are the limits on religion then? The state is limited in certain ways. How is religion limited? Well, we need to understand that there can be problems if religion recruits people for strictly worldly purposes. That is, it's enlistment in the pursuit of power, wealth, and domination, possibly imperial domination, the politicization of religion, or blending the church and state in either its atheistic theocracy, where the atheists dominate the state in a kind of religious way, or religion dominates the state. The second problem is a retreat of religious faith into a purely inward or private disposition, where I don't give two hoots about the world because it's fallen and corrupt, but everything that matters is in my private religious belief, a kind of failure to engage the world around us. And finally, a split between good and evil, religious and non-religious motives, in the sense that an ethical or religious disposition is narrowly confined to private life, while politics, especially international politics, is viewed as being entirely in the grip of immoral power politics. So to get beyond these obstacles, we need to have dialogue and interrogation, similar to what's been spelled out by the American thinker Alistair McIntyre. We need to understand our traditions as moral conversations across time. Okay, civic virtue cannot be done by the state. Lord Acton, the great 19th century British historian, noted that there are essentially two views of nationality, one which corresponded to the French and another which corresponded to the English systems. You remember it was Lord Acton who gave us the famous passage about power, that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, said Acton. Well, what Acton said must overcome the dominance of the state, the dominance of nationality by one viewpoint, is that there needs to be a move beyond a single conception of the state. We need to allow diversity all the way down. More recently, Harold Berman wrote of the limits of the use of law to guide people to virtue. And in this, interestingly, he showed how the total application of state power to lead virtue was most richly encapsulated, fully understood within Soviet communism. There, in his words, not only the law, but all social institutions and all forms of social control in the Soviet Union, including the Communist Party, trade unions, school, art, and religions, were all co-opted by the state in the direction of virtue. So in conclusion, this just takes 1 second. The state, law, and politics, and certain forms of religion, or civic totalist movements that mimic in key ways religion, pose threats to the human goods of freedom and virtue exercised within diversity. The Christian tradition learned the relationship between church and state most profoundly, in my personal view, in the long debate leading up to the acceptance in the Second Vatican Council of the document Dignitatis Humanae, which spelled out that politics can corrupt religion. Within Islam, several scholars, Said Nursi from Turkey and Abdullah an-Naim from the United States, have pointed out that the attempt to legislate Sharia would in fact corrupt Sharia itself. So understanding the role and nature of virtues, personal, communal, and civic public, may help us to bridge communities and religions in the task of understanding what matters to us as human beings and how the limits of both law and religion are key to realize human goods. Thank you.